Okay, so normally when we do these webinars, they're quite technical and we do the EPA deep dive. So we might look at something like portfolios in a session. We might look at how to prepare for professional discussions, for example. But this one, we've taken a slightly different approach to it. And this is actually based around a workshop that I delivered at an apprenticeships conference a couple of months ago, which went down really well. We got a lot of good feedback. It started some really interesting conversations actually at the conference and even afterwards with training providers and with employers, kind of bringing in new perspectives and look to the future. So there'll be a little bit of kind of technical, what does the future hold in terms of EPA? But it's really a bit more reflective, I think, than the workshops or the webinars that we tend to do. So for that reason, I would very much encourage you to please do post any questions that you've got in the chat. Chelsea's monitoring that, so we can take pauses throughout and answer any questions as we go. We've got loads of time. I think we've booked in for an hour and a half, so there'll be time at the end as well. So if there are any other questions that you've got that we haven't answered, we'll definitely can pick those up for you as well. Okay, so like I say, we've got about 90 minutes, probably be about an hour maximum of me talking, so you've got at least half an hour to get questions in. Okay, so very quickly a bit about me and DSW before we get into the details. So I'm Jake Tween. For those of you who don't know me, haven't met me, I'm Director of Apprenticeships at DSW. So I oversee the endpoint assessment organisation part of our business. So we've been around delivering EPA since it first existed. Started off in financial services, working with banks, investment firms, insurance firms and so forth, but that's massively broadened over the last few years. So the number of clients that we work with, the number of apprentices that we support, the number of standards that we assess have all grown actually in depth and breadth. So we're currently working with 125 providers, delivering EPA for over 3,000 employers across 37 standards. So I've been involved personally in apprenticeships since 2006, I believe, working for various different awarding organisations. The last 10 years have been crazy in terms of reform, really. I think everyone would agree. But certainly for me, the last 3 years of heading up a growing endpoint assessment organisation has been very insightful. And I think I've learned some really useful lessons along the way. And I'm more than happy to share those today or indeed separately with anybody kind of after the session. Okay, so a very high level agenda. So I just wanted to start off with a decade of reform. So pinch yourself, it's hard to believe it. The Richard review that kind of kicked all of this off was published in 2012. So we're a full decade on now from that, and a heck of a lot's changed since then. Then wanted to look at the regulatory jigsaw, really just to recap on who the different stakeholders are in apprenticeships, what responsibilities each of those has, both now and in the future, and just reminding ourselves of how complex that jigsaw actually is. Because I think if it's difficult to understand and difficult to keep up with for people like ourselves, for whom this is our job, this is what we get paid to do, we're on this kind of every single day of the week, it must be even more difficult to understand for apprentices and for employers, and indeed for kind of younger apprentices who we want to engage with the apprenticeship programme, for their parents, who are often key decision makers and influencers in that process. So if we're finding it difficult to understand that jigsaw, then they're going to be finding it even more difficult. So what can we do kind of individually and collectively to make that a little bit clearer? Then I wanted to talk a little bit very quickly really about bills, consultations and initiatives. So what's coming out of government, what are the policymakers saying and doing that's influencing apprenticeships on the ground now and in the future. Then I wanted to give you some insights from the EPO perspective. So things really that we've observed, how apprenticeships have transformed over the last few years, and some of the insights that we've had as an EPO. And then finishing off with what the future holds. So this is where we probably will get a little bit technical in terms of the way that newer standards and assessment plans are designed, and how those changes bear out when it comes to the delivery of apprenticeships and to the assessment of apprentices at the end of their programme once they've gone through Gateway. Okay, so we'll start off with a little bit of light fun, I guess. So If we cast our mind back to the year 2014, so the Richard Review was published in 2012. 2014 saw the very first start and the very first new style apprenticeship standards. That date's disputed, but I'm adamant it's 2014. And what I wanted to do was just bring up some images, really, to refresh our minds what was happening in 2014, what the world was like. So Chelsea, if you can monitor the chat, if anyone wants to kind of type into the chat, if you think you know what any of the images are that I'm about to share on the screen. So does anybody know what this one is? I'll give you another 20 seconds. I need a countdown timer or something, don't I? So that's the Philae lander. So 2014 was the first ever landing on a comet by a man-made spaceship. And the next one, I mean, I think this is fun. This is fun. Probably nobody else does. Does anyone know what this one is? Surely you do. Chelsea, you feel free to shout out as well if you know any of the answers. People are shy.
Is it Scottish referendum?
It's the Scottish referendum. Well done.
Okay, somebody got it in the chat.
Well done. Couple more. I won't drag it on forever, I promise. This one's my favourite. Well done, James. Yes, Suarez got hungry. Yep. So this is the 2014 World Cup finals when Suarez disgraced himself once again by biting Chiellini. And then the last one, surely everybody knows this one. Chelsea, you know this one.
Yep, I do. Gangnam Style. A lot of people getting that one in the chat as well. That one's a bit more mainstream than the...
Yeah. So that, I think 2014, if I'm right, if I'm done with the kids, it was I think Gangnam Style was the first ever YouTube video to reach 2 billion views, which it did in 2014. So just a bit of fun there, really, just to get our heads working and just to reflect on that time, what was going on in the world. So also in 2014, if we told you that this gentleman was going to run for the highest office possibly in the world, you would have probably laughed and thought I was nuts, let alone if I was to tell you that he would get voted in and become, I think, the 45th president of the United States. Also in 2014, the word Brexit didn't exist. The Referendum Act hadn't been put into place. And the UK was very much firmly a part of the European Union. So a lot has changed since then. Remember how big Brexit was as a news story, and then that's been subsumed again and then again by others. And the next two might surprise you. So 2014, we saw the first starts on the newer style apprenticeship standards, which had assessment plans allocated to them and endpoint assessments and so forth. The Institute for Apprenticeships, now IFIT, who was such key players in this, didn't even exist as an organization. So, how much has changed since 2014 in terms of the world and what was happening in the world, and some of the huge global events that have occurred in the last sort of 7-8 years. And the world of apprenticeships has changed beyond recognition in that period as well. So IFATE didn't exist, nor did the apprenticeships levy. Okay, so this stuff was still funded through the Treasury. You might argue it technically still is, but it was very much kind of centrally funded rather than through an employer-funded levy. And the Institute for Apprenticeships didn't exist, and it was the Department for Business Innovation and Skills at the time that was implementing that apprenticeships policy. So if we just look quickly then at a decade of reform and what were the key kind of stakeholders and initiatives. So DFE, largely DFE, the Department for Education, and to a lesser extent, the Education Skills Funding Agency, have always had a remit in setting policy for apprenticeships. However, that policy has been implemented and delivered through different organisations over the past sort of 8 years. So it started off, as I mentioned, with BIS, which is the Department for Business Innovation and Skills. So when the first standards came into play, when the levy came into play, certainly when the first standards came into play, BIS had that overall responsibility for apprenticeships. Then following the, I think it might have been the spring budget in 2016, BIS's remit was changed slightly and they became the Department for Business and Energy and Industrial Strategy. And very shortly after that, in 2017, the Institute for Apprenticeships was set up. And the Institute for Apprenticeships took over that responsibility of implementing the department's apprenticeships policy. Shortly after that, in 2019, the Institute for Apprenticeships remit was broadened. So they became responsible for technical education, including T-levels, and became known as IFATE as we know them to this day. So from the endpoint assessment organisation's perspective, we obviously have our own regulators who will kind of police us and audit us and look at the way that we're doing things. And that itself has changed hands a number of times over the last sort of few years, certainly since the reforms took place. So for most apprenticeship standards up until kind of now, that external quality assurance has been done by the Institute for Apprenticeships, but through an agent, which is the awarding organisation Open Awards. So Open Awards won a tender and then re-won it to basically deliver that regulatory service, that EQA, on behalf of the Institute. So as an endpoint assessment organisation, for the last few years, when we've had, say, an audit and we've had to submit our documentation and records of assessments and so forth, we've sent them to Open Awards, who then would kind of grade us and give us a report and some feedback, and then they would feed that back into the Institute for Apprenticeships, who have that overall responsibility. Now there was some sort of criticism really of the way that the EQA worked, probably fairly so, to be honest, because we found ourselves in a position where we had multiple EQA providers, so in effect multiple regulators, regulating endpoint assessment across different sectors and across different standards, which I think if you're trying to regulate something and control something, you need a degree of centralisation. And I think the more stakeholders you have involved, the more difficult it becomes to understand and therefore to regulate that thing. So a move was made to try and consolidate that regulatory activity and move the large chunk of it towards Ofqual. So that transition to Ofqual as the central regulator or external quality assurance provider of EPAOs commenced in 2018. So it's taken longer than was expected, because I think we had somewhere in the region of 300, 350 EPAOs on the register, only a handful of whom were Ofqual approved. So Ofqual have been working very closely with those organisations to try and support them with the transition into kind of an Ofqual approved organisation, because without that status, as an EPAO, you will not be allowed to deliver endpoint assessment for kind of most of the standards that are out there. So that Ofqual transition is moving along. Like I say, not as quickly as was first anticipated, but it's expected to conclude this year, I believe. So that means that by the end of this year, in theory, if all goes well, most apprenticeship standards, the EQA of that delivery and the EQA of organisations like DSW will be done solely by Ofqual. Ultimately, IFATE still have the responsibility for that activity and that regulation, but Ofqual effectively are doing it on their behalf. And I think from a personal perspective, I think it is a positive move. I do genuinely feel for some of those organisations that have struggled to get the Ofqual recognition, and we're seeing more and more now that are kind of just dropping off the register, because I know it can be really difficult to get that regulation and that recognition from Ofqual. But broadly speaking, strategically speaking, I do think it's the right thing to do. I do think it's sensible that we have an organisation that's well established like Ofqual, who are centralising that activity. It just makes it a lot clearer, it makes it a lot more consistent, and it will build trust ultimately in apprenticeships and endpoint assessment in the long term. So Chelsea, have any questions come up just while I've been chatting, or should I continue?
No questions yet, Jake.
Okay, so the regulatory jigsaw, and I use the term jigsaw on purpose because it is very, very complex. Like I said at the start, I think there's no sort of silver bullet, I think, that's going to solve this. We may kind of have frustrations about it, and we may individually think, oh, well, it'd be better if it was done like this. The reality is apprenticeships are such a huge thing, so many moving parts, so many different stakeholders, that it's inevitable that there's going to be some bureaucracy involved and that it's going to be difficult to get meaningful change made. It frustrates me personally going to conferences year after year and kind of, you know, hearing a lot of rhetoric, but seeing very little kind of tangible change. But at the same time, I appreciate that it's very difficult to actually affect those changes. So the reason I'm kind of discussing this really and bringing it up and encouraging you guys to comment on this now as well and give your feedback and thoughts and questions is to really think about, well, what can we do? What can we do to make things clearer? Ultimately, you know, we can influence policy collectively and give our views and put pressure on and lobby policymakers and so forth. But what can we be doing as people in the industry to make this clearer to our stakeholders, to our clients, and in particular, I think, to apprentices and to employers who are a really important player in this? How can we kind of hide the wiring, if you like, through the use of language that we use, through the support mechanisms that we've got, through different forums, through kind of collateral. So please do kind of contribute to this part of the discussion if you can. But what I'm going to do now, though, is outline kind of just how complicated it is, who the different stakeholders are, and what their remits are. And it's that complicated that I'm actually going to refer to my notes for this bit as well. So the Department for Education, DfE, they have the overall remit for setting education policy across the whole country, and that includes skills, FE, and apprenticeships as well. So DfE are the organisation that effectively set the policy. They have overall responsibility for the governance and operational management of apprenticeships. They have overall responsibility for the apprenticeship service. So that's the online platform that used to be called DAS. I preferred it when it was, but it's just known as the apprenticeship service now, so it doesn't have a nice acronym. And that's the online platform that providers and employers use to kind of facilitate the delivery, etc., and the funding. And DfE have overall responsibility for funding and auditing. So they are very much a government body that sets the strategy, but doesn't necessarily implement or deliver that strategy. That implementation and delivery is done by various other organisations. ESFA, obviously, they up until recently also had a remit in setting and determining policy for apprenticeships. Following a review just before the budget, so I think it was in probably February time, the government decided that ESFA would have that part of their remit withdrawn, so that the policy setting would no longer be something that ESFA did, and they focused solely on kind of writing the funding rules and enforcing the funding rules, which I think is a fair, good idea. Again, it's all about simplification and clarity as to the different roles of the different stakeholders involved. So while DfE has responsibility for those different registers, which includes the Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers, EPA register, the implementation and management of those is done by ESFA. So currently, and this is all sort of changing, but currently, as an endpoint assessment organisation, when we apply for a new standard, we have to apply to the EQA provider, e.g. Ofqual or the Institute, but we also have to apply separately to the ESFA. So again, that's being simplified, and I'm encouraged by conversations I've had with ESFA and Ofqual about the direction of travel with that and making it a bit simpler. Then we have IFATE, so that's the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. And IFATE they coordinate with Ofsted, and like I say, a lot of the on the ground regulation, if you like, is done by Open Awards and Ofqual and others at the minute, but IFATE have responsibility for that overall. IFATE publishes, and this is interesting from an EPA perspective, just to demonstrate how complex it still is currently. So IFATE publishes an EQA framework and an EQA manual, both of which are available on their website. So I'd encourage you to have a look if you haven't already. And they are quite lengthy documents. I think one of them is 45 pages, the other's maybe longer than that. And they set out what's effectively a quality assurance framework for endpoint assessment and endpoint assessment organisations with different measurements, benchmarks, which in theory, great. You've got a framework there which you work towards. We can then set all of our different processes and systems to align to that framework. However, The ESFA has another framework for endpoint assessment, which is known as the conditions for being on the register. So certain things that EPOs have to do in order to maintain their status on that register. And then we have Ofqual, who have another set of regulations. So Ofqual have their standard conditions, which they've always applied for years and years against kind of qualifications. But there are additional kind of EPA level conditions from Ofqual. So while we try and simplify things, the reality of the situation is I think things are getting better. The only constant is change in this world, which anyone that's worked in FE for more than 5 years, I'm sure will know very, very well. But there's still a way to go. So from our point of view, and I'm not saying it to whinge as an EPO, I'm just saying it to demonstrate how complicated it is for everyone involved. We've got 3 different sets of regulations there that effectively are kind of aiming to do the same thing. That's very confusing. That's distracting us from doing what we want to do, which is kind of, deliver comparable, valid, reliable assessments. So there's still a way to go, I think, in terms of simplifying the landscape for everyone involved. Then we have Ofqual, who have their traditional role, if you like, of regulating qualifications, but more and more we're seeing them have an important role to play in apprenticeships, which I think is really positive, because Ofqual know what they're doing. Their bar is very high. When they audit awarding organisations and endpoint assessment organisations, they ask lots of difficult questions. They'll peel under the surface and they'll interrogate, but I think that's good. That's what the sector needs. So very much welcome that. And then we have the Office for Students, who have the responsibility for EQA of kind of apprenticeships, EPA, for degree apprenticeships. There's an important distinction there between degree apprenticeships and degree level apprenticeships. So degree apprenticeships are those apprenticeships at level 6 and above that have an integrated degree in them, whereby the degree kind of forms part of the apprenticeship and the EPA. At DSW, we don't offer any of those, so it's not something I've personally got a big focus on. But the distinction is that with a degree level apprenticeship is that these are apprenticeships at level 6 and 7, which don't have an integrated degree. Okay, so it's just an apprenticeship that happens to be at level 6, level 7. Quite often, providers might deliver a level 7, level 6 diploma, for example, or they might even deliver a degree or an MBA alongside it, but it's not a mandatory part of it, and therefore that's known as a degree level apprenticeship. And they are not regulated by OFS, they are regulated by kind of Ofqual or whoever the EQAP is. So I'm going to pause, partly so that I can breathe. Just conscious that I've covered a lot there, and I would very much kind of like to answer any questions if there are any. I mean, Chelsea, given that you have the power of voice currently, anything in there that you would like to query, or if anyone, I think Chelsea has the power to unmute people as well, actually. So if you'd like to kind of ask a proper question, if you like, just put it in the chat and we can ask Chelsea to unmute you. But very much like I said, I'm interested in your views really as other stakeholders working with apprenticeships. Do you have similar experiences of frustrations and, are you confused at the landscape? What are you doing to help simplify that for your clients, if they are apprentices, if they are employers? And what can we do as an EPO to kind of help to achieve that? This is where I get embarrassing radio silence. That's one, yeah. Okay. So I think there is the oversight of the Trailblazer group and their standard and the communication through to them. So that's a really, really good point. And it's one that I've actually got on the slides coming up, is around, in particular, engagement with Trailblazers and who's involved in those groups, and how that has evolved, or in some cases not evolved over the last sort of decade. I think what we'll do then is I'll move on, and maybe at the end, Chelsea, if we kind of just unmute everybody and have an opportunity for an open discussion.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, fabulous, thank you. Okay. Oh yes, and the last one, how could I forget? So in February, it was also announced, when it was announced that ESFA would have their policy setting remit removed, it was also announced that there would be a new organisation called the FEHEE. I think that would have some role in setting policy. I personally haven't heard anything more about that since that February announcement. It seemed a bit odd that we had this kind of simplification, and then, by the way, there's another organisation coming in. But definitely that's something I'll be keeping a watch and brief on. And if anybody who's in the audience now knows anything about how that's developed, I'll be really interested to know. Okay, so I said I'd do this bit briefly, and I will, because I think the next bit's probably more valuable. But just to recap really on some of the bills and consultations and initiatives that have come out, there've been loads of them, loads and loads of them, but some I think more impactful than others. So I just picked out a few really. So the first is a skills bill, which was finally ratified by both houses of Parliament earlier this year. And very broad range in that bill. It covered kind of all sorts of topics around education and FE, and some bits around apprenticeships. And I think a couple of standout ones actually around apprenticeships, but the main one for me was the announcement of the legal enforcement of the Baker Clause. So the Baker Clause is something that was put in place a number of years ago, which was intended to persuade schools and sixth forms really to place equal parity on apprenticeships when giving out advice and guidance and careers advice to school leavers. Now the clause was put into place, and it was evident that kind of it was just not having any impact whatsoever. And, you know, to this day, we still speak to apprentices who've left school, have gone into further education or into employment. You ask them kind of what advice were you given around apprenticeships, and they say absolutely none. You know, I didn't know it was an option. Nobody came in to talk about it. My careers advisor didn't talk to me about it. I don't know anything about apprenticeships, which is a real travesty, actually. You know, and I could say that I could say that might sound like a selfish thing of, oh, well, I work in apprenticeships, but actually apprenticeships are hugely important and hugely powerful to people in terms of social mobility and career progression. So it really is a tragedy, I think, if young people are leaving school not even knowing what an apprenticeship is and what an apprenticeship can do for them. So the really positive thing I think that came from the skills bill was an announcement about how that's going to be legally enforced. So it'll be interesting to see how that works in practice. The apprenticeships funding band review. So a couple of years ago, I think it was now, iFate engaged in a consultation around potential changes to the way that funding bands are allocated to apprenticeship standards. Alarm bells rang when that consultation first happened. We did some analysis at DSW, and I know there were kind of other analyses done across the industry, across the sector, in particular by FE Week. They did an article at the time, and our analysis showed the same thing, which was that actually, if you looked at the methodology used for those reviews and applied it to standards within our portfolio, 30-odd standards, nearly all of them would see a drop in funding, and some of the most popular standards would see drops of kind of 50–60% in the funding, which would just, you know, the bottom would fall out of the market if that happened. So we were very concerned about it. We worked with a lot of providers and employers as well to kind of help them understand what it all meant and what the potential impact was. Ultimately, that review got kicked into the long grass, ostensibly because ESFA were also doing a review into eligible costs at the same time, and it was said that those two would be dovetailed. That didn't seem to happen, I don't think, because as far as I'm aware, the eligible costs review is still ongoing, but the funding band review has concluded, and now a new process is being piloted. The good news is that the new process is a lot better than the old one that we'd seen. And I don't think it's going to lead to kind of the disastrous cuts that we'd seen previously. Effectively, my understanding of the new process is it's being piloted with trailblazers currently. So either trailblazers that are developing a new standard from scratch, or trailblazers that are redeveloping an old standard. And they can opt in to do the kind of pilot version, if you like. And essentially, what it is the trailblazers going out to market, going out to stakeholders to get quotes and things, and coming up with more bespoke evidence-based rationale as to why they believe they should have a particular funding band. So it is set to change, but I don't think it's anything as dramatic or potentially devastating as what was initially proposed. So I mentioned before, ESFA eligible costs. This is kind of a huge bugbear, I think, for a lot of employers in particular, around stuff really that's currently deemed ineligible costs. And I think there's certain things which are not going to change. Like, I'd be very surprised if it was announced that the levy would be allowed to fund kind of apprentice wages or subsidise apprentice wages, same with travel and stuff like that. But I think where there might be some flexibility is around things like inductions, perhaps capital expenditure in certain circumstances where there's a legitimate kind of capital cost associated with an apprenticeship, and providers currently can't use their levy funding to pay for that because it's classed as CapEx. So that's as far as I'm aware ongoing, but it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. There was this arm's length body of review of the ESFA, which I mentioned, the outcome of which was that the ESFA would have its remit reduced so that it would be more focused on funding, policy, implementation and enforcement. Prisoner apprenticeships, this is another brilliant one, which again, I believe was announced in the skills bill. Doesn't affect me personally, doesn't affect DSW, but I think it's a real good news story for apprenticeships actually, and for a lot of people in our society who are disenfranchised and harder to reach. And in this case, it's prisoners who were not previously eligible to do apprenticeships because obviously you need to be in work to do an apprenticeship. The skills bill announced that there would be these new things called prisoner apprenticeships. And what the prisoner apprenticeships are intended to do is kind of solve a couple of problems. So one is to reduce the cost of reoffending, and to reduce reoffending for obviously reasons. But apparently the cost of reoffending to the economy is £18 billion per year, which is significant. So the government's kind of wisely, I think, identified that actually giving people the opportunity to develop skills and knowledge and behaviours and demonstrate their competence in particular professions will help them to get into work and to avoid reoffending when they get out of prison. So it's a really positive step, I think. And what it also does is it addresses certain kind of skills gaps that we've got, or labour shortages around particular industries like agriculture, the shortage of HGV drivers and things like that. So again, another really good initiative that, you know, personally isn't going to affect me or my business, but I think it's a really positive thing to come out of government. And then flexible apprenticeships, another really good one. So this is in recognition of the fact that there are a number of industries where apprentices, or where job contracts rather, don't typically last the 12 months. That's a minimum duration for a traditional apprenticeship. So that was excluding lots of people, for example, who work in the creative industries, where you might be working on a TV program for 6 months, and then you move on to a different studio with a different employer for another 3, and then another one. And actually, because of their working circumstances, they weren't able to engage with apprenticeships, and flexible apprenticeships allow them to kind of have a portable apprenticeship that they take from one employer to another, is my understanding. Again, it's not something that's really impacting on DSW as such, but it's another really good initiative, really just to demonstrate that it's not all doom and gloom, and there is some really good progress being made. And some of it's very kind of learner-centric, I think, which is where we need to remember our focus needs to be. I've just spotted a question in the chat, so I've got to pick up on that one. So one from Chelsea, some questions on my mind. Do you think EPOs will ever have to contract with employers directly instead of training providers? So it has always been and is still the case that the employer should select the endpoint assessment organisation for their apprentices. I think most of us know that 90% of the time that's not really necessarily what happens in practice, mainly because the employers don't have the right information to select an EPO, don't particularly want to. They'll trust the guidance they get from the training provider. But ESFA were touting an initiative a couple of years ago, whereby it would be a requirement that EPOs would contract directly with the employers, and that the funding mechanism would change. So currently what happens is obviously the employer pays everything via the apprenticeship service to the provider, and then the provider pays the EPO for the endpoint assessment. For whatever reason, I think there are some good reasons for it actually. The government wanted that contract and that funneling of the money to go directly from the employer to the EPO. But again, that's been kind of kicked into the long grass, if not kind of permanently outruled as an option. From our point of view, I think it would just be unworkable, because we work with 125 training providers. That's 125 different contracts to manage, 125 different relationships to have, which is fine and is manageable. But actually, we at any one time are assessing apprentices from 3,000 plus employers. So could we manage 3,000 contracts, 3,000 relationships? No, I don't think we could. What do you think IFA can do to stop apprentices withdrawing after getting their on-programme qualifications? Wow, this is a very hot topic at the moment. So we as an EPO, we're seeing a huge amount of churn. So last year, I think fewer than half of the apprentices who were scheduled to hit their gateway with DSW did. So some of those will just be delayed gateways for a number of different reasons, but some of them will have dropped off their programme. This has been raised, we've raised it with kind of the likes of IFA and ESFA, et cetera, to try and understand, is this a problem for everyone in the industry? And I think the answer to that is broadly speaking, yes. And what are the causes of it? And so Jennifer Coupland, who's the CEO of the Institute, spoke about this at the annual Apprenticeships conference a month or so ago. And it is something I feel very, very aware of. And actually, it seems that the reasons people withdraw from their programme are varied. So in some cases, they are just getting their... So where there's a mandated on-programme qualification, without a doubt, there are some apprentices who get that qualification and then think, I ain't going to bother doing my EPA because I don't see the value in the EPA. The qualification is what I want. That's what I've got. So goodbye. There are even some employers I would kind of hazard to say that have a similar attitude, which is a bit unfortunate. So I think there's a bit of an education piece for us to do as providers and endpoint assessment organisations, and indeed for the government, of really promoting the value of that endpoint assessment over and above the qualification. But actually, it's not just that people are getting the qualification and dropping off. There are other reasons as well. So one that IFIT gave, which again we have experience of, is apprentices who start on their programme and actually they get promoted, and which is great for the apprentice, and that's ultimately the kind of thing that the apprenticeship itself is seeking to do. But they're moving into a role where it's a different role to the one they were doing previously. They don't need necessarily to do the apprenticeship anymore. And so therefore they drop off the programme. So there are loads and loads of different reasons. 20% off the job's always cited as a reason. Difficulty in achieving the English and maths requirements is another reason. And just being really, really busy at work and not having time to commit to your apprenticeship. So loads of different reasons why apprentices are dropping off. I don't think that there is, from what I've seen, a political appetite to really do much about that. And even if there were, I kind of think it would be a bit of a losing battle. Have all the initiatives in the world and all the incentives and use all of the right language. But the reasons people are dropping off programme are kind of, very varied, as I say, and I think there's very little we can do to stop some of those things. I think when it comes to the qualifications, that's really frustrating because it's almost an abuse of the levy, really, if people are doing that knowingly. Starting an apprenticeship, knowing they're never going to complete it and they just want the qualification, is an abuse of the levy, let's be frank. I think those types of behaviours can be mitigated through things like the design of the endpoint assessment, so tying the achievement of the qualification in with the achievement of the apprenticeship, withholding the award of the qualification until the apprentice has gone through EPA. There are different solutions that are in place for that particular problem. I will move on now because I think that's all the questions for now. Yeah. Okay, so from an EPA perspective, what have we seen and what do we think needs to improve? So firstly is the rigidity of the standards, and this is a real pain point actually. And the best way to describe this, I guess, is that when we had apprenticeship frameworks, they were quite flexible, they were quite malleable. So they were usually made up of an NVQ, which was your skills-based, kind of competency-based qualification, and then a TECSA, technical certificate, which covered the knowledge. And within those qualifications, you often had kind of pathways. And so you could mold the apprenticeship program towards each individual apprenticeship, so it fitted what they did in their day-to-day role. That all kind of went out the window when we moved into apprenticeship standards, and in particular with the newer standards that have been published in the last sort of 18 months or so. they are all or nothing. So some of them will have pathways in them, which I think is a positive move. So it can be slightly tailored towards the particular occupation an apprentice is in. But most standards, you have to hit all of the KSBs in order to achieve the apprenticeship. And there aren't many other forms of qualification where that's the case, particularly where it's a summative assessment, like an endpoint assessment is. So, for example, you've got an apprentice going into an interview where it's predetermined in the assessment plan, you must meet the following descriptors. And they are big, chunky descriptors. When you break them down, there's often 5 or 6 component parts to each. You've got to hit all of that, and you've got to do it under exam conditions with the person that you've never met before. It is a big ask. As an EPO, we can try and influence that, and we are feeding back all the time, feeding back to the Institute where it's an existing standard, feeding back to Trailblazers where they're developing a new standard and they've invited us to contribute, is we will challenge and we will say, okay, well, if you think about that, that's going to be difficult for the apprentice to understand, it's difficult to digest, difficult for them to do all of those things. So we do try and influence it. And I'm going to talk shortly about kind of Trailblazers and the role that we play, and we all can play in them. But really, it's just an awareness, I think, for anyone involved in the delivery of apprenticeships. There's more and more with the newer style standards is less flexibility and more of a structure, which in many ways is good because it's very clear to the apprentice, this is the assessment method, this is what you have to meet in that method. So great, they've got advance warning of it, but actually when it comes to the assessment, they need to be well prepared, they need to perform really well, because if they don't, ultimately they may fail that method. Trailblazer representation, so like I just mentioned. So I've got this on this slide and on the next one. So I've got this in terms of what can improve, but also what's going well. So historically, I think it was a bit hit and miss with Trailblazers, and most of them I think were encouraged to exclude actually providers and endpoint assessment organisations from the sessions. Do I know why? Not necessarily. I think potentially because there was a fear, perhaps from policymakers, that we have a vested interest and we want to influence things. We do want to influence things, but in a positive way. We don't want to do it to kind of make our lives easier or our clients' lives easier. We want to do it so that we've got valid, reliable, deliverable assessments. So that can improve. It's definitely got better, in particular in financial services, which is kind of the majority of the standards that we assess at DSW. The Trailblazers themselves have been brilliant. So the Trailblazer chairs have come to us and have come to providers and said, look, we want you to contribute. And so when they're writing their duties and the KSBs, they're asking us what we think of it. And in particular, when they're writing the assessment methodology, that's when we as an EPO will contribute and say, okay, well, from our experience of delivering thousands of these things, that ain't going to work in practice. Have you considered doing it like this? And I think that has been brilliant. It's been really good. They've engaged with us. They've listened to what we've said, and they've made kind of changes. So they haven't just paid a lip service to it. So that's really good. But actually, worryingly, that's still not a consistent picture. So there clearly isn't anything from a policy perspective around when it's important to engage with providers, when it's important to engage with assessment organisations. It still seems to be very much left to the discretion of individuals, which is concerning, because I think, again, it comes back to that need for consistency. Should be consistent, and I absolutely think that providers and assessment organisations should be routinely feeding into Trailblazers, and that feedback should be acted upon, because some of the legacy standards that we've got are just, some of them are practically undeliverable, and those issues could have easily been identified had we been invited to contribute in the first place. Loss of apprenticeships expertise. This is definitely getting better. So I noticed, moving from frameworks to standards from an awarding body point of view, that with the frameworks, you typically had kind of assessors who would coach the apprentices. It was a very iterative process. They'd go in once a month and help them tick the boxes and stuff, which I think it was legitimate to question that. And I think it was legitimate to introduce a notion of endpoint assessment, because I've done apprenticeships myself in the past where I've got my certificate at the end of it and I've thought I didn't earn that. Somebody's come in and they basically coached me through it. So I do, genuinely think that things like endpoint assessment are good. But I think one thing that I've observed is from that transition from the frameworks to the standards is a loss of expertise and experience within the training provider community. So those coaches that were going in and coaching the assessors were themselves assessment experts. They had the A1 qualifications. They were often IQA qualified as well. The move to standards changed from it being these assessors supporting the apprentices to kind of skills coaches, talent coaches, which I think is great in terms of they are people from industry that understand that occupation really well and can mentor the apprentices. And that has been of huge, huge, huge value. But certainly in the early days, I think what I personally noticed was a lack of kind of assessment, understanding and experience, which is absolutely not a criticism at all of training providers, and do not want to be considered in that way. But actually, I think it was an oversight as an industry that assessment expertise, it was kind of assumed, well, the assessment's done by the EPAO, so we don't need to do that anymore. Whereas actually, I think the understanding of the assessment is absolutely critical to supporting the apprentices when it comes to building their portfolios, preparing for their professional discussions and interviews. But that has definitely changed over the last, certainly sort of 12 months. And a lot of providers that we're working with who've said they've recognised that themselves, and they're bringing in expertise and people who have experience of assessment and of endpoint assessment, really just to kind of upskill the coaching community that they've got, so that they feel more empowered and more courageous really to make decisions and to support their apprentices. So this next one's, it's still a big problem. I think, again, it's the one that's potentially getting better, and it relates to the first point really, I think, around rigidity of standards. Because the standards are really rigid and the apprentice is going to be expected to cover off all of the KSBs, that skills scan at the beginning of the program is really important, and making sure that the apprentice is in a role where they can demonstrate competence against all of those KSBs is not just important, it's essential. Because if they can cover off 99% of the KSBs and there's one that they can't do because they don't do it as part of their role, they will fail their endpoint assessment. So making sure, first of all, that the apprentices are on an appropriate standard that aligns to their job. Usually it won't, because it's highly unlikely that an apprenticeship standard is going to map to every single person doing that job across the country. So what that means is either you don't put the person on that apprenticeship, or you work with their employer to say, okay, I understand that their role involves this, this, and this. In order to pass their apprenticeship, they're also going to need to demonstrate that they can do this. So an example is kind of team leader. There are certain parts of the team leader standard, which, to be honest, you could argue shouldn't have been put in there in the first place, but which the majority of team leaders, I would say, do not actually do. So it's things like managing budgets, managing projects, things like that are quite high level. Most people that are team leaders and on a team leader apprenticeship don't do those things. What that means then is if an employer wants to put somebody onto that apprenticeship program, they need to give them that responsibility at some point in that journey. They don't need to be doing it from day one, because I get that these people are apprenticeships and some of them might be school leavers and so forth. But by the time they get to endpoint assessment, certainly in the last few months of their apprenticeships, they should have been given those opportunities. Otherwise, as an assessment organisation, we can't make that judgment that that person's competent because we haven't seen them do that part of the role. So it's really important, actually, is understanding that the future direction of travel is very much, you have to hit all of these KSBs. None of them are optional. You can't kind of, simulate these activities except in rare circumstances. So that onboarding piece is really important, and that relationship with the line manager and the employer is more important than it's ever been. Because usually what I've seen is that promise is made at the start. Yeah, by the time they get to the gateway, they'll have done all of these things and they'll have had that exposure. And quite often they haven't, because business as usual's taken over. They've been took off to deal with this emergency over there. So the buy-in of the employer, and actually the employer sticking to that commitment, is really important, and it's vital actually towards the EPA being successful. So what can improve? Regulation and standardization. So as endpoint assessment organisations, we have a requirement to do standardisation and IQA activities, and we are audited against that by Ofqual and others. What isn't present as a requirement and what isn't consistent still is the standardization across EPAOs. And again, this is one that's getting better, but it's really been driven currently by two things, as in cross EPAO standardization. The first is Ofqual. So Ofqual have put in place a field engagement team who are really good. They're brilliant, actually. And they've been set up really to engage with endpoint assessment organizations and understand some of the challenges that we have in delivering endpoint assessment on the ground, particularly with some of the old assessment plans, which are very poorly written and ambiguous and often erroneous. So that team's been doing really good. We've been working with that field team and with other endpoint assessment organizations to look at the way that we're delivering against those standards and to say, okay, well, actually, we're doing that bit slightly different, and to come together and to standardize and to actually change our processes and our approaches so that we're delivering it in the same way. In theory, I think that becomes less of an issue with the newer plans because they're more clearly written, there's less ambiguity in them. But certainly with a lot of these legacy standards, which is almost all of them at the minute, that lack of standardization and lack of consistency across EPAOs still exists. And the final one's the high rates of churn and delays to EPAO. Again, with the drop-offs, I think there's not much we can do about it. At a policy level, I think we can look at ways of tying in qualifications with the EPA to stop people getting a call and dropping off. But I don't think we're going to see any significant improvement really to those very, very high drop-off rates. I know the latest data was published not so long ago, and it was, I'm sure, saying that more than half of apprentices had withdrawn from the programme. Like I say, various different reasons for that. And the delays, so very, very rarely will an apprentice actually hit gateway on the date that they're supposed to. And I think a lot of the reasons for those delays are the same reasons for people dropping off the programme. From the training provider's point of view, I get that the longer the delay goes on, the worse the situation gets, because quite often they're then out of funding. They're still having to do the 20% off the job because they haven't the gateway yet. And actually, if they're delayed because they're busy at work, they ain't going to be doing the 20% off the job. So I think doing everything we can to get people to hit gateway when they're supposed to is really important as well. Okay, and I mentioned before legacy standards. So there's some standards that we're assessing that were published in 2014, 2015 that still haven't been reviewed. You're talking about sort of 8 years down the line. It's supposed to be reviewed every 3 years. And some of them appear not to be scheduled for review. So it's a really slow process, and I think it's a capacity issue more than anything else. IFA has their ultimate responsibility for deciding which new standards get developed and for prioritising existing standards for redevelopment. And I know they do use like labour market intelligence, occupational maps. So they are informed decisions, but nonetheless, it does mean that you've got a lot of standards that are very, very old now, very, very kind of not at all compliant with current policy. And the process for updating those is really slow. I'm just going to pause because I've just seen another question in the chat there, which I'll pick up on. I think there were a couple actually. Okay, so we've got 3 questions, so I'll answer those now. So the first is from Jenna. I support business admin apprentices. Do you think the standard has been phased out as they removed the level 2 and the numbers have been very low since the standard came in? It's a good question. I would love to pretend I know the answer to that, Jenna, but I don't personally, though, think that there's an intention to phase the business admin out. I know there's a lot of push still from some really big players, like including the NHS, to get a level 2 published, and that's been going on for years now. We assess the level 3, and to be honest, the numbers aren't huge on it. I think one of the challenges with the business admin is that the assessment plan is really, really poor. It desperately needs to be rewritten. I believe that Trailblazer has been reformed. The fact that it's been reformed suggests that there is an appetite to continue with the level 3, but I think it's really, really unlikely that a level 2 will get approved. I think that the government, the policy makers and IFA are not sold on the idea that a level 2 business admin is sufficiently challenging enough to warrant 12 months plus of training. I'm going to sit on the fence with that one as to whether I think it is. Next question then. So it's from Jason. Hi, Jake. Apologies if I missed at the beginning. I've recently attended an ALP conference and there was a discussion around EPA being more embedded into the program, not just end of program assessment. Do you know any more on this? Yeah, so I think I might have been in that same workshop, Jason. So this came up and it was a workshop I attended at the annual Apprenticeships conference, and it was an I-FATE workshop around mandatory qualifications in apprenticeships. And they did say as part of that workshop, as part of their presentation, that one of their strategies was to make sure that the EPA... oh, sorry, I think I've misunderstood your question, Jason. So around EPA being more embedded into the program and not just an end of program. So I don't know anything about that actually, Jason. And if you could share that maybe at the end when we have the open discussion, or we could pick up offline, because I'll be really interested in that. I do think that there's still a misconception that EPA is this bit that comes at the end and it's a bolt on. And I think that that's a flawed logic and a flawed approach. It's concerning the number of apprentices who will come to us for their assessment who don't know anything about EPA and aren't prepared. So I think anything that can be done to make the apprentices more aware of what EPA is, not scared of it or intimidated by it, because actually, you know, it's a very transparent process in terms of what the assessment methods are, what the KSBs are. Very difficult to pass, I think, if you're not prepared and familiar with what the criteria are. Many instances quite easy to pass if you are, because if you put the work in, it's very difficult to fail. So anything I think that can be done around embedding EPA within the ON program, I think would broadly speaking be positive. And one more question, which is, I'm seeing more clients outside of financial services inquiring about compliance and risk apprenticeships, but within retail, if the role suits, but outside of financial services, would this be acceptable? So I do know that the Trailblazer group for compliance and risk, so this is a level 3 and a level 6 standard, it has been fed back into them that at the minute, the way that they've been written is very much with a focus on financial services, because I believe embedded within the KSBs are references to the FCA, Financial Conduct Authority, which kind of narrows, I think, the pool of people that are eligible. But that has been fed back, and I do believe there's an appetite to broaden those standards, because obviously there are people working in a range of different occupations where compliance and risk, but pretty much every sector of the economy really has compliance and risk to focus on. So James, I'm happy to pick that up with you separately, but my understanding is at the minute that standard is reserved for financial services apprenticeships, but the appetite is to, when it's rewritten, is to broaden it out. But we can definitely discuss that in a bit more detail. Okay, I think I might be almost at the end of my slides. Yeah, so got what works well, and then what the future holds. So conscious it's 11, so I'll not dwell on these for too long. Second. Okay, so the numbers have dropped. You know, the levy, when it came in, it was supposed to increase the numbers of apprenticeships. It had the opposite effect. I've noticed the government now says that's kind of almost what was intended, and it's a good thing that there are fewer numbers, because it means that they're better quality apprenticeships. I think take that with a pinch of salt, but I do think that I genuinely think that the apprentices who we're seeing go through EPA are better qualified than apprentices who went through on the frameworks. And I'm speaking from a position of somebody who's overseen apprenticeships for a number of years, both frameworks and standards, and somebody that has done 2 framework apprenticeships in the past and currently doing a standard now. The level of rigor is significantly higher than it was previously. So I do believe that although the numbers are lower, I do believe that the apprentices that are coming through and getting passes and getting distinctions are better qualified than perhaps people on previous iterations of apprenticeships, and better qualified, you know, than a lot of their peers who might have went to university or kind of been in employment since they left school. I've got no doubt about that, to be honest. COVID-19 learning. So obviously, I mean, it had a huge impact on everybody, but one of the positives that came out of COVID from our point of view was the real spirit of collaboration between providers and ourselves, but also ourselves and other endpoint assessment organizations. And we all got together and shared best practice and shared ways of working and use of technology. And actually that's, you know, certainly with remote technology, it's something we were doing anyway pre-COVID, but it's great to see that that's been adopted more broadly by the industry. And I think that that spirit of collaboration actually is continuing. So we formed relationships with people that are effectively our competitors during COVID, kind of, because, you know, necessity is the mother of invention, so to speak. But those relationships have gone on. And so actually, if we've got a query about something and, okay, how do you guys approach that? We're much more inclined, and the door's much more open now for us to have those conversations. So I think that that was something good to come out of COVID-19, and it's something that's working really well. Support and collaborations, same thing, really. Absolutely, the standards and assessment plans, although I have some frustrations with them at the minute, and in the main is the fact that the past descriptors and distinction descriptors are really detailed. What we are seeking to do as an endpoint assessment organisation is break those down. So for the apprentice, so that they're really clear on these are the things that you want to be, that we're going to assess you against. Instinctively, part of me wants not to do that, because I get that the idea is to make it more of an holistic assessment. But the fact is, and we've queried this with Ofqual and with the Institute, and it's been made very clear to us that apprentices have to meet those descriptors in full in order to pass their EPA. So actually, I think it's a lot fairer on the apprentice to break those descriptors down. Otherwise, there's a big risk that they look at their evidence, they look at the descriptor and think, great, I've met it. And there's a small part of it that they haven't, and then they might fail because of that. So we're breaking it down for apprentices, and we're also breaking it down in terms of the feedback that we give to apprentices following the event. So making some changes in that respect. But certainly the format of the assessment plans is much, much better now than it ever used to be. A lot of the older plans, it wasn't clear how the grading worked. They had arbitrary ratings in them and lots of kind of conflicting statements. All of that's been removed now, and the plans are a lot clearer. More involvement now with ourselves and training providers on the trailblazers, but like I said before, still not consistent. And the high profile of apprenticeships, so you can't open certainly the likes of FE News or FE Week without reading about apprenticeships. All of the headline articles are always about apprenticeships. They feature very heavily in the mainstream media as well now. So I think that that profile of apprenticeships has been significantly raised in the last 10 years, as has the perception of apprenticeships. There's still a long way to go with that, and there's still, I hate the word, but there's stigma around apprenticeships. Not necessarily a stigma, I don't think, but more it's evolved from a stigma into just a continued misunderstanding, I think, around what they are, who they're for, and what value they bring. But that's definitely changing. I think that kind of parity of esteem argument is finally being won over after years and years of debating it endlessly. And so I'll just finish then, and then still a bit of time for questions if anyone's got any on what the future holds. So it's changing to grading descriptors. It's just what I mentioned before. So I think it's positive in that the assessment plans now will say, okay, this is your assessment method. It's a portfolio-based professional discussion. So we're assessing the apprentice in a professional discussion. It will be 1 hour long, and the apprentice must demonstrate the following past descriptors. That's very, very clear. But like I said before, quite often the past descriptors are complex and they're compound. So I think as training providers, it's really important that you note that and that your apprentices are aware of that we have had it unequivocally now from both of our key regulators that the apprentices must meet all of those descriptors in their entirety. So we can't use our discretion. Our assessor can't sit down and think, well, actually, you know what, that person, there are 12 descriptors in there and they nailed 11 of them, so I'll pass them. They can't do that. They have to pass them all. They have to provide evidence against them all. So it's really important you understand that, and that apprentices understand that and are suitably prepared. Next one is the non-assessed portfolios. So in essence, if it's a non-assessed portfolio, which they all are now, treat it in exactly the same way as an assessed portfolio is the best bit of advice that I could give. So portfolios as an assessment method are being phased out. There's still a lot of the legacy standards where they exist as an assessment method, but it's very, very core to IFA policy that a portfolio that's constructed on program should not be assessed. So therefore, what we tend to have is a portfolio-based professional discussion or a portfolio-based interview. So in essence, what that means is the portfolio will be a load of rubbish. The apprentice can nail their interview and still pass. But without doubt, I can tell you that from what I've observed, what we predicted and what we've observed is that the apprentices who have the better portfolios perform better in those professional discussions, perform better in those interviews, because taking the time to map the evidence in the portfolio helps the apprentices to understand those KSPs, those descriptors in detail. So when they're going into their assessment, they've got an example in front of them that they can refer to. They can stick to that example so they don't get distracted and don't waffle on about something that's irrelevant. And the really key thing, I think, with the portfolio is that it sets the scene and provides the context. It's a great opportunity for the apprentice to tell the assessor about themselves and tell them about the work that they've done and demonstrate the way they've gone about their work before they're even assessed. When you think about it, that's a phenomenal opportunity. You're a lot more likely to pass that interview if you presented a really good portfolio that's well mapped. Because otherwise, in the interview, what you're doing is you're effectively, if you use, say, the STAR technique, the apprentice is going into that interview and saying, oh, well, this happened on this date, and this is who was involved, and this is what I had to do, this is the action that I took. And a lot of that detail can be covered off in the portfolio. So actually, you're basing the interview question or the professional discussion on the example in the portfolio. The assessor already knows all of that background because they've read it in the portfolio. So effectively, what they're going to do is question them around, okay, well, tell me about why did you do it like that? How did you reflect on it? So it just makes it a much more streamlined assessment process. Even though it's not assessed, it still has a significant impact upon the final grade. So I would say be mindful of the assessment methods that are coming out. So largely speaking, I think the assessment methods haven't changed, actually. The project's probably the one that's changed the most, and we're starting to see more a move away from kind of on-program projects and things like that, and more things like project proposals. So for those of you that deliver the level 5 operations manager, you'll see that the apprentice doesn't have to do a project from start to finish. And I suspect that's out of a recognition that actually that's quite a hard thing to coordinate, and you're going to end up with arbitrary projects that are set purely for apprentices who've gone through Gateway. So just be mindful, I would say, and read kind of, certainly in DSW's case, read the toolkit to understand kind of how we're approaching that and what supporting documents are available. But case studies is a really, 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 really important one that I wanted to focus on. So we see a few standards now that I've got case studies. And the reason I highlight these is that they are entirely hypothetical by nature. And so apprentices sometimes struggle with the case studies more than they do with other methods of assessment. So case study, for example, is where the apprentice goes into invigilator conditions. They have to read a case study, which is a fictional scenario about somebody working in a business in their occupation, and then they have to answer questions either on paper or verbally about that case study. What apprentices tend to do is they tend to struggle to relate to the case study, and that's because we have these fixed standards. So the standard's been written for someone in that occupation. Well, if I take insurance, for example, you might have somebody that works in a very, very small insurance brokerage where there are only 3 people that work there in Yorkshire. Then you might have somebody that works at Lloyd's of London or a big, massive corporation that's, global corporation, hundreds of thousands of staff. Their actual experience is very, very different to each other's. So when they're going into that case study, they have to be able to kind of remove themselves from that mindset of what they're familiar with and actually just focus on the case study of what are they being asked. So it's not a very common assessment method case study, but what I would say is if you're delivering standards that have got a case study as an EPA, use the mocks, get the apprentice to sit the mock, get feedback from the apprentice afterwards. Did they understand it? Was there anything that they struggled with? And continue to feedback to us, because if there's anything we can do to support these types of things, we absolutely will. We're committed to doing that. Timed EPA windows is a really, really important one. So with all the older standards, they either just didn't stipulate whatsoever what the EPA period was supposed to be, or they would say, oh, it's typically 4 months, it's typically 3 months, but there was nothing in there to kind of enforce those timescales. What that means is we've got loads of apprentices who've been, in EPA for ages, which isn't great. So I think the move towards timed windows is positive. But what it means is you have to be absolutely on the ball as a training provider once the apprentice goes through Gateway to make sure that they complete within that maximum period. And also that if there's a specified sequence of events that's stuck to, because what it will say in the assessment plan is if the apprentice doesn't complete it within that window, they fail the whole EPA and they have to start the whole thing again. So read the toolkit, make sure that you understand what the timings are and have mechanisms in place to monitor that per apprentice, which is difficult to do. It's difficult for us to do because obviously we have to do that on our end as well. But I think it is probably the right thing to do to make it a bit more of a consistent assessment. So the other kind of big change is this off-call transition. What it's meant is a massive kind of culling of EPAOs. So I think there were about 350, like I say. Once this off-call transition has completed, I think that'll be reduced to, possibly making this up, but somewhere in the region of 100. So a significant reduction in the number of EPOs that are operating in the sector, which in some cases I think is a good thing. But like I say, I do feel for those who struggle to get through that process because it is very, very challenging. Changes to policy. So the only constant is change in this business. So we can expect further changes. I think there's not an appetite necessarily because obviously the Chancellor made a reference to the levy in the budget and then seemed to backtrack on it. When it comes to the levy, I don't think there's going to be anything major that changes with that because broadly speaking, it's not that unpopular a tax. We often have kind of pressure from the CBI and others saying, oh, well, you need to make it more flexible in terms of what employers can spend it on. But I don't think there's going to be any kind of wholesale overhaul of the levy because why would you fiddle with something that broadly speaking is working? It means that, you know, billions of pounds worth of funding is coming from an employer tax rather than directly from the Treasury. So I think it would be unnecessarily potentially foolish to try and make any kind of big policy changes. So I think what we'll probably see is more continued tweaks. We'll just hope that they're sensible and tweaking in the right direction. And then finally is the growth of degree apprenticeships, and in particular degree level apprenticeships for DSW. So there was a chart actually that somebody, might have been DFE, shared at the annual apprenticeships conference, and that showed the growth and decline of different standards at different levels, and degree level apprenticeships have grown 200-300% year on year, and we've seen that too. From our point of view, you know, the popularity of level 6, level 7 apprenticeships is soaring, and there's a lot of bad press about those apprenticeships, but I think actually they're very good things and they serve a purpose. I think there's room and currently there's enough money in the pot for apprenticeships at all levels. If we talk about things like parity of esteem, and it doesn't make sense to say let's have parity of esteem between degrees and apprenticeships, but not allow degree level apprenticeships. That's a nonsense argument. So I think they're a very, very positive thing, as long as they kind of don't dominate and don't ultimately end up taking away from lower level apprenticeships and those that are hardest to reach. So that was it really. So bit of time now if there are any questions. I think what I'll do is I'll answer. Nope, actually there aren't any more questions in the chat. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and Chelsea, if you could stop the recording, and then we'll allow, if anyone's left and anyone wants to ask any questions, to